There is a moment every single one of us knows. The moment right before something big. A test, a presentation, a conversation you have been dreading, a performance where everyone is watching. In that moment, your body tightens, your thoughts scatter, and the very thing you need most, a clear and steady mind, disappears exactly when you need it most. You have felt this before. Maybe you are feeling it right now just thinking about it. And here is the truth nobody tells you. That reaction is not a flaw in your character. It is not proof that you are weak or unprepared. It is simply an untrained brain doing what untrained brains do under stress, reacting instead of performing. The good news, and the entire reason this audiobook exists, is that focus and calm are not personality traits handed out to a lucky few. They are trainable skills built the same way a muscle is built, through repetition, structure, and the right techniques applied consistently over time. By the time you finish listening to this, you will understand exactly why your mind loses control under pressure, and more importantly, you will have a complete system to prevent it from happening again. You will learn how to build a focus so deep that distractions lose their pull. You will learn how to regulate your nervous system so that pressure no longer hijacks your thinking. You will learn the exact mental protocols used by elite performers, from top athletes to surgeons to executives, to stay composed when the stakes are highest. This is not about pretending to be calm while panicking on the inside. This is about rewiring how your brain actually responds to stress at a biological level so that composure becomes your default state rather than something you have to fight for. If you have ever choked under pressure, lost your train of thought when it mattered most, or watched someone else stay cool while you fell apart internally, this is for you. What separates those people from everyone else is not talent, it is training. And by the end of this audiobook, you will have that training too. Let us begin. The focus myth. Most people believe that focus is something you either have or you do not. They watch someone work for hours without distraction and assume that person was simply born wired differently. This belief is not just wrong, it is dangerous, because it gives people permission to give up before they even try to build the skill. Focus is not a personality trait. It is a physical capacity, built through the same mechanisms that build a stronger body. And once you understand this, everything changes. Here is the first myth we need to destroy. The idea that focus means forcing yourself to concentrate through sheer willpower. Willpower is a limited resource. It drains throughout the day, which is why you can focus easily on a task at 9 in the morning and struggle to read a single paragraph by 9 at night. If your entire strategy for focus depends on gritting your teeth and pushing through, you will lose that battle every single time your willpower runs low, which is most of the day. Real focus is not about forcing your brain to behave. It is about removing the friction that pulls your attention away in the first place, and then training your brain's actual capacity to sustain attention over time. Think about your brain like a muscle you have never trained. If you tried to lift a heavy weight for the first time in your life, you would fail immediately. Not because you are weak-willed, but because the muscle has not been conditioned to handle that load. Attention works the exact same way. Every time you check your phone mid-task, every time you let your mind wander without noticing, every time you switch between 5 browser tabs instead of finishing one thing, you are training your brain to have a short attention span. You are, without realizing it, building the exact opposite skill of the one you want. The second myth is that multitasking makes you more productive. Neuroscience has shown repeatedly that the brain does not actually multitask. It rapidly switches between tasks, and every switch costs you time, energy, and mental clarity. People who believe they are excellent at multitasking are often the worst performers on any single task, because their brain never fully commits to anything. If you want deep focus, the goal is not to do more things at once. It is to train your brain to do one thing completely before moving to the next. The third myth, and perhaps the most damaging one, is that focus is purely mental. It is not. Your ability to concentrate is deeply tied to your physical state, your sleep, your blood sugar, your stress hormones, and your environment. You cannot think your way into focus if your body is working against you. A brain that is exhausted, dehydrated, or flooded with cortisol will struggle to concentrate, no matter how disciplined you try to be. This is why some of the techniques you will learn in this audiobook are not purely mental tricks. They involve training your physiology alongside your mindset, because the two are inseparable. So if focus is trainable, how do you actually train it? It starts with understanding that your brain has a natural rhythm of attention. Cycles of high focus followed by necessary rest, and fighting against that rhythm is what burns people out and destroys their ability to concentrate long term. Instead of forcing endless hours of strained attention, elite performers work in structured intervals, pushing hard during periods of deep focus and deliberately recovering in between. This single shift, working with your brain's natural rhythm instead of against it, is one of the most powerful changes you can make, and we will build a complete protocol around it in the chapters ahead. Understand this now. You were never missing the ability to focus. You were simply never taught how to train it. That changes today. There is one more piece of the focus myth worth addressing directly, and that is the belief that focus should feel effortless once you are good at it. This belief causes people to quit the moment training feels hard, because they assume struggle means something is wrong. In reality, the opposite is true. The friction you feel when building a longer attention span is identical to the friction a runner feels when extending their distance for the first time. Uncomfortable, sometimes frustrating, but a direct sign that adaptation is happening beneath the surface. Elite performers do not experience less friction than everyone else. They have simply learned to interpret that friction correctly, as evidence of growth rather than evidence of failure. This reframe alone changes how people respond to difficulty, because instead of retreating the moment concentration becomes uncomfortable, they recognize that exact discomfort as the edge of their current capacity, precisely the point where real training happens. Keep this in mind as you move forward, because every technique in this audiobook will, at some point, feel harder than you expect. That difficulty is not a sign to stop. It is the mechanism through which the skill is actually built. There is also a subtle danger in comparing your current attention span to the attention span of someone you admire, whether that is a colleague, a public figure, or simply an idealized version of who you think you should already be. This comparison almost always ignores the years of accumulated practice behind that other person's ability, and it tempts you to judge your starting point as inadequate rather than simply as a starting point. Every person who now works with remarkable focus once struggled the same way you might be struggling now. Distracted, restless, unable to sit with a single task for more than a few minutes. The difference is not some inherent advantage. It is simply time invested in deliberate practice. And that same investment is available to you starting today. Measure yourself only against your own baseline. Tracked honestly over weeks, and you will see the kind of steady, undeniable progress that comparison to others almost always obscures. The nervous system reset. Before we talk about performance, before we talk about mental techniques, we need to talk about your nervous system, because nothing you learn in this audiobook will matter if your body is stuck in a constant state of alarm. Here is what almost nobody understands about pressure. It is not primarily a mental experience, it is a physiological one. When you walk into a high-stakes situation, your brain does not carefully evaluate whether the threat is real or imagined. It simply activates the same survival response your ancestors used when running from predators. Your heart rate spikes. Your breathing becomes shallow. Your muscles tense. And blood flow shifts away from the parts of your brain responsible for clear thinking and toward the parts responsible for immediate physical reaction. This is why people describe their minds going blank during a big moment. It is not that they suddenly became less intelligent, it is that their nervous system rerouted resources away from rational thought and toward pure survival mode, exactly as it was designed to do thousands of years ago. The problem is that a job interview, a big presentation, or a critical conversation does not require you to run or fight. It requires you to think clearly, and your ancient nervous system has not caught up to that reality. This is why trying to calm down using logic alone so often fails. You cannot simply tell yourself to relax when your body is flooded with stress hormones, because the body does not respond to logic in that state. It responds to physiological signals. This is the key insight that changes everything. If pressure is a physical state, then calm must also be trained physically, not just mentally. The fastest and most reliable way to reset your nervous system in real time is through your breath, because breathing is the one autonomic function you can consciously control, and it acts as a direct line of communication to your nervous system. When you breathe rapidly and shallowly, you signal danger to your brain, reinforcing the stress response. When you breathe slowly and deeply, particularly extending your exhale longer than your inhale, you activate what is known as the relaxation response, telling your nervous system that you are safe even in a stressful environment. This is not a soft or symbolic gesture. It is a measurable physiological shift, one that lowers heart rate, reduces cortisol, and restores blood flow to the thinking regions of your brain. Elite performers across every field use this same principle, whether they call it box breathing, tactical breathing, or simply taking a moment before they act. The specific pattern matters less than the consistency of practicing it, because like any skill, your ability to calm your nervous system on demand improves dramatically with repetition. There is a second layer to this reset, and it involves your physical posture and tension. Your body sends signals to your brain just as much as your brain sends signals to your body. When you clench your jaw, hunch your shoulders, and tighten your chest, you are physically reinforcing the stress response, even if your thoughts are trying to stay calm. Deliberately relaxing your shoulders, unclenching your jaw, and softening your posture sends a competing signal, one that tells your brain the threat has passed. This is why simply adjusting your physical state, standing taller, breathing slower, Releasing unnecessary tension can shift your entire mental state within seconds. The third layer is recognizing your personal early warning signs of stress before they escalate. Everyone has a unique pattern, a tightening in the stomach, a racing thought, a shift in breathing that signals the stress response beginning. Most people ignore these signals until they are already overwhelmed. High performers learn to notice these signals early in the first few seconds and apply their reset techniques immediately, before the nervous system fully escalates. This is the real secret behind people who appear naturally calm under pressure. They are not immune to stress. They simply catch it earlier and interrupt it faster than everyone else. In the chapters ahead, you will learn the specific protocols to build this skill, but understand the foundation now. Calm is not something you wait to feel. It is something you actively create through your breath, your posture, and your awareness. Every single time pressure arrives, it helps to understand why this training works so reliably once you commit to it. Every time you deliberately activate your breath, adjust your posture, and notice your early warning signs, you are not just managing a single stressful moment, you are teaching your nervous system a new default pattern, one repetition at a time. The nervous system does not distinguish between practice and reality in the way you might think, which means that even calm, deliberate breathing practiced during a quiet moment at home begins strengthening the same neural pathways you will rely on during an actual high-pressure event. This is why the athletes, performers, and professionals who handle pressure most gracefully are almost always the ones who have practiced these physiological resets hundreds or even thousands of times in low-stakes settings, long before they ever needed them in a high-stakes one. You do not have to wait for a real crisis to begin this training. In fact, waiting for the real moment is the least effective time to learn a new skill, because your resources are already consumed by the pressure itself. Practice your breath work when you are calm. Practice noticing tension in your shoulders and jaw when nothing is wrong. Build the pathway before you need it, so that when pressure does arrive, your body already knows exactly what to do. A simple daily practice makes this training accessible to anyone, regardless of schedule or experience. Set aside just a few minutes, ideally at a consistent time each day, and practice slow, deliberate breathing paired with a conscious scan of your body for tension, starting at your jaw and shoulders and moving down through your chest and hands. This does not need to be elaborate or lengthy to be effective. What matters is consistency, because the nervous system responds to repeated, reliable signals far more than to occasional, intense effort. Within a few weeks of daily practice, most people notice that their baseline stress level throughout ordinary moments of the day begins to drop. Not just their ability to recover during acute pressure, because the entire nervous system becomes more resilient through this kind of regular, deliberate training. The 3 pressure traps. Now that you understand the biology behind pressure, we need to identify the specific mental traps that make it so much worse. Because most people are not just reacting to stress itself, they are making it exponentially harder through patterns of thinking they do not even realize they are engaging in. There are 3 major traps that consistently sabotage performance under pressure, and once you can recognize them, you gain the power to interrupt them before they take control. The first trap is what we will call the spiral of anticipation. This happens when your mind jumps forward into a future that has not happened yet, imagining every way things could go wrong, replaying worst-case scenarios over and over, until the imagined failure feels as real and threatening as an actual event. Your brain cannot always distinguish between a vividly imagined threat and a real one, which means that spiraling into anticipated failure triggers the exact same stress response as if the failure had already occurred. The tragedy of this trap is that people exhaust themselves emotionally and physically before the actual moment even arrives, walking into the real challenge already depleted, having fought 100 imaginary battles in their mind. The way out of this trap is not to force yourself to stop thinking about the future, which rarely works, but to redirect your mental focus to the present moment and the very next action in front of you, rather than the entire outcome. The second trap is the comparison spiral, where you measure yourself against an idealized version of how you think you should be performing, or against other people who appear more confident or skilled. This trap is particularly dangerous because it shifts your attention away from the task itself and onto self-judgment. And self-judgment consumes enormous mental resources that could otherwise be used for actual performance. When you are silently criticizing yourself in the middle of a high-pressure moment, you are essentially trying to perform two demanding mental tasks simultaneously: the task itself and an internal trial where you are both defendant and prosecutor. No wonder performance suffers. The antidote here is recognizing that self-judgment in the moment serves no functional purpose. It does not improve your performance. It only distracts from it and can be consciously set aside until after the moment has passed, when reflection actually becomes useful. The third trap, and perhaps the most subtle, is what we call the control illusion trap, where a person becomes fixated on controlling outcomes that are simply not within their control, whether that is how someone else will react, what questions will be asked, or how a situation will ultimately unfold. This fixation creates a constant undercurrent of tension because you are fighting against reality itself, trying to force certainty in situations that are inherently uncertain. High performers do not eliminate uncertainty. They make peace with it, shifting their focus entirely toward what is actually within their control: their preparation, their effort, their reactions, and their next decision. This shift from outcome focus to process focus is one of the most powerful mental adjustments you can make, because it grounds your attention in something achievable rather than something unpredictable. What makes these three traps so dangerous is that they often occur together, feeding into one another. Anticipation fueling comparison, comparison fueling the need for control, control fueling more anticipation, creating a compounding spiral that can overwhelm even highly capable people. But here is the empowering truth. Every single one of these traps requires your active participation to continue. The moment you notice you are anticipating imagined failures, comparing yourself unfavorably, or gripping tightly to things outside your control, you have already interrupted the automatic pattern, because awareness itself breaks the spell these traps rely on to operate unconsciously. In the chapters ahead, you will learn specific techniques to build this awareness quickly and consistently, so that these traps lose their grip on you long before they have a chance to derail your performance. It is worth naming one more pattern that tends to accompany all three traps, and that is the tendency to treat every high-pressure moment as a referendum on your entire worth or ability, rather than as a single, isolated event among thousands you will face across your life. When a moment feels like it defines you completely, the emotional stakes become artificially inflated, and inflated stakes are exactly what feed anticipation, comparison, and the need for control in the first place. Reminding yourself, honestly and specifically, that this one moment, however important, is not the sum total of who you are or what you are capable of, releases a surprising amount of unnecessary pressure. This is not about lowering your standards or caring less about the outcome. It is about accurately sizing the moment so your mind stops treating a single presentation, conversation, or performance as an existential threat. Once the stakes are sized correctly, the traps we just discussed lose much of their emotional fuel, and clear thinking becomes far more accessible. There is also a practical exercise worth building into your regular routine, something we will call the trap audit. At the end of each day, or after any moment that felt unusually stressful, take a few minutes to honestly identify which of the three traps was most active. Whether you were anticipating imagined failures, comparing yourself against others, or gripping tightly to outcomes outside your control. Simply naming the specific trap, rather than leaving it as a vague sense of anxiety, begins training your brain to recognize the pattern faster the next time it appears. Over weeks of consistent practice, this recognition speeds up dramatically, moving from something you only notice in hindsight to something you catch in real time, and eventually to something you anticipate and interrupt before it even fully forms. This is the same principle behind every skill in this audiobook. Awareness, followed by deliberate practice, followed by automatic response, and the trap audit is simply a structured way to accelerate that process, specifically around the mental patterns that sabotage performance under pressure. Deep focus training. We have established that focus is trainable and that pressure creates specific physiological and mental obstacles. Now it is time to build the actual system for training deep, sustained focus. Because understanding the theory means nothing without a practical method you can apply immediately. The foundation of deep focus training rests on a concept called attention span conditioning. The deliberate practice of extending the length of time you can sustain concentrated effort on a single task without distraction. Just like physical training, this must be done progressively, not by immediately forcing yourself into hours of unbroken concentration, but by starting where your current capacity actually is and gradually extending it over time. If your honest current attention span for deep work is 20 minutes before your mind starts wandering, then 20 minutes is your starting point, not 60. Trying to force 60 minutes immediately will simply result in 20 minutes of real focus and 40 minutes of your brain quietly resisting and drifting, which reinforces the very pattern you are trying to break. The first practical tool is the structured focus interval, a defined period of complete, undivided attention on a single task, followed by a deliberate recovery period before the next interval begins. During the focus interval, every possible distraction must be eliminated in advance, not managed in the moment. This means your phone is in another room, not simply turned face down beside you. Notifications are fully disabled, not just muted, and your workspace contains only what is needed for the task at hand. The reason this matters so much is that willpower spent resisting distractions during a task is willpower stolen from the task itself. So the goal is to remove the need for willpower entirely by eliminating temptation before it can arise. The second tool is what we call single-tasking discipline, the deliberate practice of working on exactly one task until either it is complete or the focus interval ends, with zero exceptions, zero quick check-ins, and zero switching. This will feel uncomfortable at first, particularly if you have spent years training your brain toward constant task switching. But this discomfort is a sign the training is working, the same way muscle soreness signals growth after physical exercise. Push through the initial resistance and you will notice, often within just a few sessions, that your ability to sustain attention begins improving measurably. The third tool involves training your brain to tolerate boredom and mental friction without immediately seeking relief through distraction. Modern life has conditioned most people to associate any moment of mental discomfort or boredom with an immediate escape. A phone check, a snack, a conversation, anything to avoid sitting with an unstimulating moment. This constant escape mechanism destroys your capacity for sustained focus because deep work inherently involves periods of friction, moments where a task feels tedious or difficult, and if you have trained yourself to flee from any discomfort, you will flee from these moments too, right when persistence matters most. Deliberately practicing sitting with boredom, whether during a waiting room moment or a mundane task, without reaching for a distraction, is a genuine form of mental training that directly transfers to your ability to sustain focus during demanding work. The fourth tool is environmental design, structuring your physical space so that focus becomes the path of least resistance rather than something you have to fight to achieve. This includes having a dedicated space associated only with focused work, so your brain begins to automatically shift into a focused state simply by entering that environment, the same way your brain shifts into a relaxed state when you enter a bedroom associated only with rest. It also includes removing visual clutter, which silently taxes your attention even when you are not consciously aware of it, and controlling ambient noise in a way that supports rather than fragments your concentration. The fifth and final tool in deep focus training is tracking your progress, not through vague impressions of how focused you felt, but through concrete measurement, the actual length of your focus intervals, the number of times you noticed your mind wandering, and how quickly you were able to redirect your attention back to the task. This data matters because improvement in focus is often gradual and difficult to notice day to day, but becomes undeniable when you can see the trend over weeks and months. Combine these 5 tools consistently: structured intervals, single-tasking discipline, boredom tolerance, environmental design, and progress tracking, and you will build a level of sustained attention that most people will never achieve, simply because most people never train this capacity deliberately in the first place. This is not a talent you were denied. It is a skill you have not yet built. And building begins the moment you apply these tools. One final point on deep focus training deserves emphasis, because it is often overlooked entirely. Recovery is not the opposite of focus. It is a required component of it. The brain cannot sustain deep, effortful attention indefinitely, and attempting to do so without structured recovery does not produce more output. It produces diminishing returns, followed by mental exhaustion that can take days to fully recover from. This is why the most productive people are not necessarily the ones who work the longest hours. They are the ones who pair intense, focused effort with genuine, deliberate rest, stepping fully away from stimulation rather than simply switching from one demanding task to another. A short walk without your phone, a few minutes of simply sitting without any input, or even brief physical movement between focus intervals allows your brain's attention systems to genuinely reset rather than slowly degrade across the day. Treat recovery as part of the training itself, not as time stolen from it. And you will find that your capacity for deep focus compounds week after week, instead of slowly eroding under the weight of constant, unbroken effort. It is also worth addressing what to do when, despite your best efforts, your mind still wanders during a focus interval, because this will happen, even to highly trained individuals, and how you respond to it matters enormously. The instinct for most people is to treat a wandering mind as a failure, sometimes even scolding themselves internally for losing focus. But this reaction actually makes the problem worse, because it adds an additional layer of stress and self-judgment on top of the original distraction. The more effective response, one used consistently in disciplined focus practices across many fields, is to notice the wandering without judgment, calmly acknowledge that your attention drifted, and gently redirect it back to the task, treating each redirection as a successful rep rather than a failure. In fact, the moment you notice your mind has wandered and bring it back is precisely where the training happens, in the same way that the moment a muscle strains against resistance is where physical strength is actually built. Do not chase an unrealistic standard of never losing focus at all. Instead, aim to reduce both how often your attention drifts and how long it takes you to notice and correct it, because that is the metric that genuinely improves with practice, and it is the one that will serve you far better than any expectation of flawless, uninterrupted concentration, composure under fire. Everything we have covered so far builds the foundation, the biology of pressure, the mental traps that sabotage you, and the training required for deep focus. But there is a specific skill that separates those who perform brilliantly in high-stakes moments from those who fall apart. And that skill is composure under fire, the ability to remain clear and steady in the exact instant when pressure is highest and there is no time to prepare. This is different from general calmness, because it must be accessible instantly, in real time, often with seconds to spare before you need to speak, act, or decide. The first technique for building this kind of instant composure is what we call the anchor breath. A single, deliberate breath used the moment you feel pressure spike, distinct from the longer breathing practices used for general nervous system regulation. This is not a slow, extended breathing exercise. It is a fast, deliberate reset. A single inhale through the nose for a count of 4, held briefly, and released slowly through the mouth for a count of 6, performed in the exact moment before you need to perform. Whether that is stepping onto a stage, opening your mouth to answer a difficult question, or reacting to unexpected news. This single breath will not eliminate the pressure entirely, but it interrupts the automatic escalation of the stress response just enough to restore a degree of clarity, and that small margin often makes the difference between a composed response and a panicked one. The second technique is the physical reset, a deliberate, almost invisible adjustment of your body in the moment of pressure, dropping your shoulders, unclenching your jaw, softening your grip if you are holding something, and consciously slowing the pace of your movements. Because your brain reads physical tension as confirmation of danger, these small physical adjustments send an immediate competing signal, and this signal can shift your internal state within seconds, faster than trying to think your way into calm ever could. The third technique is narrowing your focus to the very next action, rather than the entire situation. When pressure spikes, the mind tends to expand outward, toward the entire scope of what is happening. Every possible consequence, every person watching, every way things could go wrong. This expanded focus is overwhelming by design, because it is simply too much information for the brain to process clearly in a moment that requires immediate action. High performers deliberately narrow their attention down to the smallest actionable unit. Not the entire presentation, but the next sentence. Not the entire negotiation, but the next question. Not the entire performance, but the next movement. This narrowing is not avoidance, it is strategic focus, because the entire situation will always resolve itself through a sequence of individual next actions, and mastering each next action is far more achievable than mastering the overwhelming whole all at once. The fourth technique involves reframing the physical sensations of pressure themselves. The racing heart, the surge of adrenaline, the heightened alertness. These sensations are often identical, whether you interpret them as anxiety or as excitement, because physiologically, the two states are remarkably similar. The difference lies almost entirely in the label your mind assigns to the sensation. Elite performers train themselves to consciously relabel these sensations, telling themselves internally that this is their body preparing them to perform at their best, rather than a signal that something is wrong. This reframe is not denial. The physical sensations are completely real, but the interpretation of those sensations, and therefore their emotional impact, is something you have genuine influence over. The fifth technique is having a pre-built response ready for the specific moment you feel yourself losing composure, a rehearsed action, whether it is the anchor breath, a physical reset, or a specific phrase you say internally, so that in the actual moment of pressure, you are not trying to invent a solution from scratch. You are simply executing something you have already practiced. This is why preparation for composure matters just as much as preparation for content. Because knowing what you want to say means very little if pressure derails your ability to say it clearly. Composure under fire is not the absence of pressure. It is the presence of a trained response that activates the instant pressure appears, and like every skill in this audiobook, it becomes more automatic and more reliable every single time you practice it deliberately. Consider for a moment the people you have watched who seemed almost unbothered in moments that would overwhelm most others. The speaker who handled a hostile question without flinching, the athlete who made the game-winning decision in the final seconds, the professional who delivered difficult news with total steadiness. It is tempting to assume they simply do not feel pressure the way you do. But that assumption is almost always false. They feel the same racing heart, the same surge of adrenaline, the same initial jolt of alarm that anyone would feel in that position. What separates them is not the absence of that internal experience. It is the presence of a trained sequence they have run so many times that it activates almost automatically: the breath, the physical reset, the narrowed focus, the reframed sensation, executed within seconds, often without them even consciously naming what they are doing anymore. This is the destination of everything covered in this section so far. Not the elimination of pressure, which is neither possible nor even desirable, since a certain amount of pressure sharpens performance, but the development of a reliable, internal response that keeps you clear, steady, and effective exactly when it matters most. In the chapters ahead, we will build on this foundation further, moving into mental rehearsal, recovery after setbacks, and the deeper systems that make composure not just an occasional achievement, but a consistent, dependable part of who you are, under any level of pressure you might face. One last point matters here, and it is easy to overlook. Composure under fire is not something you build once and then possess permanently. It is a skill that requires ongoing reinforcement, much like physical fitness fades without continued training. This does not mean you need to practice constantly or obsessively, but it does mean that treating these techniques as a one-time fix rather than an ongoing practice will eventually lead to their effectiveness fading. The people who maintain composure reliably across years of high-pressure situations are not the ones who mastered it once and moved on. They are the ones who continued returning to these fundamentals: the breath, the physical reset, the narrowed focus, again and again, until the practice itself became simply part of how they operate. Give yourself permission to see this as a long-term relationship with your own nervous system rather than a problem to be solved and forgotten. And the results will compound in ways that a single burst of effort never could. Mental rehearsal and visualization. There is a reason elite athletes, surgeons, musicians, and public speakers spend as much time rehearsing inside their minds as they do practicing in physical reality. And it is not superstition, it is neuroscience. When you vividly imagine performing an action, your brain activates many of the same neural pathways it would use if you were actually performing that action, engaging motor planning regions, sensory processing, and even some of the same physiological responses. This means that mental rehearsal is not a soft, optional extra layered on top of real preparation. It is a genuine form of training, one that can strengthen the exact patterns you will need when the real moment arrives. But most people who attempt visualization do it wrong, imagining only a vague, idealized version of success, a blurry sense of things going well, without any real detail or structure. And this kind of vague rehearsal produces very little benefit. Effective mental rehearsal requires specificity. You need to imagine the actual environment, the sounds, the sensations in your body, the exact sequence of what you will say or do, and crucially, how you will feel and respond in the moment pressure spikes, not just the moment of triumph at the end. This is the piece almost everyone skips. They rehearse success but never rehearse the difficulty that leads to it, which means when real difficulty arrives, it feels unfamiliar and destabilizing because their mind never prepared for it. Instead, deliberately visualize the challenging moment itself, the difficult question, the unexpected setback, the wave of nerves right before you begin, and then rehearse your trained response to it: the breath, the physical reset, the redirection of focus you learned in earlier chapters. By rehearsing both the difficulty and your composed response to it, you are essentially preloading the experience so that when it happens in reality, some part of your brain recognizes it as familiar territory rather than a completely novel threat. This single shift, rehearsing the struggle and not just the success, is what separates visualization that actually improves performance from visualization that simply feels pleasant but changes nothing. There is a second important element to effective mental rehearsal, and that is engaging multiple senses rather than relying purely on visual imagination. Many people default to only seeing the scene in their mind, but the most powerful rehearsal incorporates what you would hear, what you would physically feel in your body. Even subtle details like the temperature of the room or the weight of an object in your hand. The more sensory detail you include, the more completely your brain treats the rehearsal as a genuine experience, and the stronger the neural reinforcement becomes. A third element involves rehearsing from what is called an internal perspective, imagining the scene through your own eyes as though you are actually there, rather than watching yourself from outside as if viewing a movie. Internal perspective rehearsal tends to produce a stronger transfer to real performance because it more closely mirrors how you will actually experience the moment when it happens. Consistency matters here just as much as it does with every other skill in this audiobook. A single vivid visualization session before a major event can help, but the real power comes from regular, brief rehearsal sessions built into your routine over days or weeks, leading up to a high-stakes moment, training your brain gradually the same way physical practice trains your body. Even 5 to 10 minutes of focused, detailed mental rehearsal, performed consistently, produces measurable improvements in confidence and performance, because you are quite literally strengthening the neural pathway between intention and execution every time you engage in it. Understand that mental rehearsal is not about convincing yourself that everything will go perfectly. It is about becoming so familiar with the full range of what might happen, including the hard parts, that nothing catches you off guard. And familiarity, more than optimism, is what produces genuine composure when the real moment finally arrives. There is a practical way to build this practice into your life without it feeling like an added burden on top of everything else you are already doing. Attach your mental rehearsal sessions to an existing routine you already follow, whether that is the few minutes before you fall asleep, a portion of your morning while you are getting ready, or a short window during a daily walk, so that the practice becomes woven into moments you already have, rather than requiring you to carve out entirely new time. Consistency, even in small doses, produces far greater results than occasional, lengthy sessions performed sporadically, because the brain strengthens neural pathways through repetition far more reliably than through intensity alone. As you build this habit, you will likely notice something interesting happen over time. The line between rehearsal and reality begins to blur in a useful way, meaning that when you actually step into the real situation you have been rehearsing, some part of your mind recognizes it, not as something entirely new, but as something you have already lived through many times before, even if only in your imagination. This sense of familiarity is not an illusion. It is the direct result of the neural reinforcement you have been building, and it is one of the most reliable ways to walk into any high-stakes moment with a grounded sense that you already know, on some level, exactly how to handle whatever unfolds. One additional refinement worth practicing is varying the specific scenarios you rehearse, rather than repeating the exact same imagined sequence every time. If you only ever visualize one particular version of events, your mind builds strong familiarity with that specific version, but real life rarely unfolds exactly as scripted, and an unexpected variation can still catch you off guard even after extensive rehearsal of a single fixed scenario. Instead, deliberately vary the details across different rehearsal sessions, imagining different questions, different reactions from others, different small disruptions, so that what you are truly training is not a single memorized sequence, but a flexible, adaptable readiness that holds up regardless of the exact form the real situation takes. This approach mirrors how the most resilient performers actually prepare, not by scripting one rigid version of success, but by building genuine comfort with a wide range of possibilities, so that whatever specific shape the real moment takes, some version of it already feels familiar territory. Finally, treat mental rehearsal as a skill that improves the more you practice it. Just like every other technique in this audiobook, your first attempts at vivid, detailed visualization may feel awkward or difficult to sustain. Your mind wandering or the imagined scene feeling thin and unconvincing. And this is completely normal rather than a sign you are doing something wrong. With repeated practice, your ability to construct a rich, detailed mental scene improves substantially, the same way any imaginative or cognitive skill sharpens through use. And performers who have practiced this technique for years often describe their rehearsal sessions as feeling almost as vivid and real as the actual event itself. Give yourself the same patience with this skill that you would give yourself with any other new capability you are building throughout this audiobook, trusting that consistency over time will produce a level of mental preparation that occasional, half-hearted attempts never could. The pre-performance routine. If mental rehearsal prepares your mind in the days and hours before a high-stakes moment, the pre-performance routine is what prepares you in the final minutes. And this narrow window matters more than most people realize. The period immediately before a demanding event is often the most volatile time for your mental state, when nerves are highest and the temptation to either over-prepare frantically or spiral into anxious thinking is strongest. Elite performers across nearly every field, from professional athletes to concert musicians to surgeons entering an operating room, rely on a consistent, structured routine during this window, not because the specific actions within it are magical, but because the predictability of the routine itself creates a powerful sense of psychological safety and control, precisely when everything else may feel uncertain. Your brain finds comfort in familiar sequences, and a pre-performance routine gives it exactly that. A series of known, practiced steps that signal to your nervous system that you have been here before, even if the actual event ahead is new. Building your own pre-performance routine starts with identifying what genuinely helps you feel grounded and prepared, rather than copying someone else's routine exactly, because what calms one person might not calm another. That said, there are several components worth incorporating into almost any effective routine. The first is a physical component, some form of deliberate movement or stillness that helps regulate your nervous system, whether that is a short walk, a few minutes of stretching, or simply sitting quietly and applying the breathing techniques covered earlier in this audiobook. The second is a mental component, a brief period of focused review, not frantic last-minute cramming, but a calm, confident pass through your key points or intentions, reinforcing what you already know rather than trying to add new information under pressure, which almost always backfires. The third component is a verbal or internal cue, a specific phrase or statement you say to yourself that signals the shift from preparation into performance mode, something brief and consistent that you use every single time, so that over repeated use, it begins to trigger a genuine physiological and psychological shift, simply through association. The fourth component, often overlooked, is protecting this window from external disruption as much as possible. Because absorbing someone else's last-minute anxiety, rushing due to poor time management, or being pulled into unrelated demands right before a high-stakes moment can undo much of the calm you work to build. Treat this window as protected time, worthy of the same respect you would give to any other critical part of your preparation. One of the most powerful aspects of a consistent pre-performance routine is that it becomes portable across completely different contexts. Once trained, the same sequence of breath work, brief review, and a grounding cue can be used before a job interview, a difficult conversation, a competition, or a public performance. Because what you are really training is not knowledge specific to any one event. You are training your nervous system's transition from preparation into composed action. This is why experienced performers often look remarkably similar in their behavior in the minutes before wildly different types of high-pressure events. Because the routine itself, not the specific content of the event, is what creates the calm, focused state they need. Build your own version of this routine now, before you need it, and rehearse it during lower-stakes moments, so that by the time a truly important event arrives, the routine itself feels like second nature rather than something new you are attempting under pressure for the first time. It is also worth acknowledging that circumstances will not always allow you the full version of your ideal routine. Sometimes you will be rushed, sometimes the environment will be unfamiliar or chaotic, and sometimes external factors will limit how much preparation time you actually have. Because of this, it helps to build a compressed version of your routine alongside the full version, a shortened sequence that captures the most essential elements, perhaps just the anchor breath and your internal cue phrase, something you can execute in under a minute when circumstances demand it. Having this compressed version ready means you are never left without any grounding tool at all, even in the least ideal conditions, and practicing both versions in advance, the full routine and the compressed one, ensures that whichever version circumstances allow, you are still drawing on something familiar and trained rather than improvising from scratch under pressure. Over time, many performers find that even this compressed version becomes remarkably effective on its own, precisely because it has been rehearsed so consistently that it retains much of the grounding power of the longer routine, despite taking a fraction of the time to execute. It is also worth mentioning the role of transition moments. The brief window between finishing your routine and actually stepping into the high-stakes situation itself, because this gap, even if only a few seconds, is often where nerves make one final attempt to resurface. Rather than treating this transition as dead time, use it deliberately, a final steady breath. A small physical cue, like unclenching your hands or straightening your posture. Something brief that carries the calm you built during your routine directly into the first moments of the actual performance. Without this deliberate bridge, it is surprisingly common for someone to feel composed throughout their entire preparation, only to feel a fresh spike of nerves the instant the real moment begins, essentially losing the benefit of everything they just did. Treating the transition itself as part of the trained sequence, not simply the empty space between preparation and performance, closes this gap and ensures the calm state you built carries forward into the moment that actually matters. Recovering from mistakes in real time. No amount of preparation eliminates the possibility of mistakes. And one of the most decisive factors separating strong performers from everyone else is not whether they make errors, because everyone does, but how quickly and effectively they recover when a mistake happens in the middle of a high-stakes moment. Most people have never trained this skill at all, because they spend all their preparation focused on getting things right, and none of it focused on what to do the instant something goes wrong, which means when a mistake does happen, they are navigating completely unfamiliar territory at the worst possible time. The first and most important shift in recovering from real-time mistakes is understanding what happens psychologically in the moment, right after an error occurs. There is an almost universal human tendency to freeze briefly, replaying the mistake, feeling a surge of embarrassment or frustration. And this internal reaction, if left unmanaged, often causes a second, compounding mistake, because your attention becomes consumed by the first error rather than returning to the task at hand. This is why skilled performers talk about the danger of what is sometimes called the mistake spiral. One small error triggering internal panic, which then causes a second error, which triggers more panic, until a minor stumble has snowballed into a genuinely damaged performance. Breaking this spiral requires a specific, trained response. And the first step is radical acceptance of the mistake the instant it happens, not minimizing it or pretending it did not occur, but acknowledging it internally in a single brief moment without extended self-judgment. Something as simple as internally noting that a mistake happened and it is now in the past. This acceptance is not passive resignation. It is an active mental move that prevents the mistake from consuming further attention than it deserves. The second step is an immediate physical reset. The same anchor, breath, and posture adjustment covered in earlier chapters, applied specifically in this moment, because a mistake triggers the exact same stress response as any other pressure spike. And the same tools that calm general pressure apply directly here. The third step, and perhaps the most valuable, is redirecting your attention immediately to the very next action, exactly as we discussed regarding narrowing focus under pressure, because dwelling on a mistake that has already happened does nothing to improve your performance going forward, while focusing entirely on executing the next moment gives you genuine influence over what happens next. There is also real value in mentally rehearsing this exact sequence in advance. Deliberately imagining yourself making a mistake during your mental rehearsal sessions and practicing this recovery response, because just as with composure under fire, having a pre-built reaction ready means you are not trying to invent a recovery strategy in the heat of the moment. You are simply executing something already trained. It is worth noting that audiences, evaluators, and other people present during a high-stakes moment are almost always far less aware of small mistakes than the person making them assumes, and even when a mistake is noticed, how you recover from it often matters more to how you are perceived than the mistake itself. A performer who stumbles and recovers smoothly, with composure and confidence, is frequently remembered far more favorably than one who never stumbled at all but seemed rigid and overly cautious throughout. This reframe, that recovery, is actually an opportunity to demonstrate genuine skill and composure rather than simply damage control, changes how mistakes feel the moment they happen, transforming them from purely negative events into moments where your trained response can actually become a strength rather than a weakness. There is also long-term value in reviewing mistakes after the pressure has passed. Once you are in a calm, reflective state, rather than in the middle of the event itself. This delayed review, conducted honestly but without harsh self-criticism, allows you to extract genuine lessons, identify what specifically triggered the error, and refine your preparation or technique for the future, something that is impossible to do effectively in the heat of the moment, when your primary task is simply recovering and continuing forward. The distinction between in-the-moment recovery and after-the-fact reflection matters enormously, because conflating the two, trying to deeply analyze a mistake while you are still in the middle of performing, is precisely what fuels the mistake spiral discussed earlier. Train yourself to postpone the analytical reflective process until after the pressure has fully passed, trusting that you will return to it later. And in doing so, you free yourself in the moment to simply execute your recovery response and continue forward without the added burden of trying to solve or fully understand the mistake while still under pressure. There is one more distinction worth making clear. The difference between a mistake that requires an active correction in the moment and a mistake that simply requires acceptance and forward movement. Some errors demand an immediate adjustment, a factual correction stated aloud, a changed course of action, while others are better left alone entirely, since drawing further attention to a small, largely unnoticed slip can sometimes cause more disruption than the original mistake itself. Developing the judgment to quickly distinguish between these two categories, the correctable and the better left alone, is itself a skill that improves with experience, and it prevents the common overcorrection pattern where someone repeatedly apologizes for or references a minor mistake long after it would otherwise have gone unnoticed, inadvertently drawing far more attention to it than the mistake ever warranted on its own. It is also worth recognizing that your relationship with mistakes, shaped over years, often long before you ever thought about performance under pressure, deeply influences how naturally this recovery process comes to you. If you grew up in an environment where errors were met with harsh criticism or embarrassment, your nervous system may have learned to treat any mistake as a significant threat, triggering a stronger stress response than the situation objectively warrants. Recognizing this pattern, if it applies to you, is not about assigning blame to your past. It is about understanding why recovery might feel harder for you than the techniques alone would suggest, and giving yourself permission to practice this skill with extra patience, knowing that you are not just learning a new technique, but potentially retraining a much older, deeply ingrained response. Over time, consistent practice of the recovery sequence described in this chapter can genuinely reshape this older pattern, proving to your nervous system, through repeated direct experience, that a mistake is survivable, recoverable, and far less catastrophic than it may have once felt. Building unshakable confidence. Confidence is one of the most misunderstood qualities in high performance, because most people believe it is a prerequisite for performing well, something you need to feel before you can act, when in reality, genuine, durable confidence is built primarily through the accumulation of evidence from repeated action, not the other way around. This distinction matters enormously, because if you are waiting to feel confident before you attempt something difficult, you may be waiting indefinitely. Since confidence rarely arrives before competence, it develops alongside it and often slightly behind it. The first principle in building unshakable confidence is understanding that confidence is not a single fixed trait you either have or lack. It is a specific belief in your ability to handle whatever a particular situation demands, built through direct evidence that you have handled similar demands before. This is why confidence tends to be domain-specific rather than universal. Someone can feel completely confident speaking in front of large audiences while feeling deeply uncertain in a one-on-one difficult conversation, because their evidence base differs across these two contexts. Understanding this allows you to stop treating confidence as some abstract personality quality you either possess or lack overall, and instead treat it as something you can deliberately build in any specific area through targeted, repeated exposure and honest reflection on your own growing evidence of capability. The second principle involves distinguishing between two very different sources of confidence: outcome-based confidence, which depends on things going well, and process-based confidence, which depends on knowing you have prepared thoroughly and trained your response to pressure, regardless of how any single outcome unfolds. Outcome-based confidence is fragile because it collapses the moment an outcome does not go your way, while process-based confidence remains remarkably stable even after a setback because it is rooted in something you actually control, your preparation and your trained response, rather than something you do not control, the final result. Shifting your internal narrative from needing things to go well in order to feel confident toward trusting your preparation and your ability to handle whatever happens produces a far more resilient and durable form of confidence, one that survives contact with an imperfect and unpredictable reality. The third principle in building this kind of confidence involves deliberately seeking out and tracking evidence of your own growth over time, because most people are remarkably poor at accurately remembering their own progress, focused instead on how far they still have to go rather than how far they have already come. Keeping even a simple, honest record of moments where you handled pressure better than you would have in the past, situations where your trained techniques genuinely helped, gives you concrete, undeniable evidence to draw on during future moments of doubt. Evidence that is far more powerful than vague self-encouragement because it is specific and true. The fourth principle involves recognizing that a certain amount of nervous energy before a high-stakes moment is not evidence of a lack of confidence. It is simply your body preparing to perform, and confident performers do not eliminate this sensation entirely. They simply stop interpreting its presence as proof that something is wrong. You can feel your heart racing and your palms sweating, and still walk forward with genuine confidence. Because confidence was never about the absence of nervous sensation in the first place. It was always about your trust in your ability to perform well despite it. Build this trust deliberately, through preparation, through mental rehearsal, through recovery from mistakes handled well, and through honest tracking of your own growth, and you will find that confidence stops being something you desperately hope to feel before a big moment and becomes something you can reliably access because you have built the actual evidence that earns it. It is worth addressing directly why so many people struggle to build this kind of confidence despite genuinely improving over time. And the answer often lies in an internal standard that keeps moving just out of reach. As soon as a person reaches a level of skill they once considered impressive, they frequently recalibrate their expectations upward almost immediately, comparing themselves now to a new, higher standard rather than acknowledging the real growth that brought them to this point. This pattern, sometimes described as a shifting goalpost, can leave even genuinely capable people feeling perpetually behind, never quite allowing themselves to register the confidence their actual track record has earned. Breaking this pattern requires a deliberate act of honest acknowledgement. periodically pausing to recognize, in concrete terms, how far you have actually come from where you started, not measured against some idealized future version of yourself, but measured against your own genuine starting point. This is not about becoming complacent or losing the drive to keep improving. It is about allowing yourself to actually feel the confidence your progress has legitimately earned, so that confidence can serve its intended purpose, supporting your performance in the present moment, rather than being perpetually deferred to some future point you never quite allow yourself to reach. Confidence also has a social dimension worth understanding, because how you carry yourself communicates something to the people around you well before you say a single word. Posture, eye contact, the pace of your speech, and the steadiness of your movements all send signals that others read, often unconsciously, as evidence of your competence and composure. This does not mean confidence is merely a performance for others. The internal work covered throughout this chapter remains the genuine foundation, but it does mean that consciously adopting steady, grounded physical behavior, even in moments when you do not yet feel fully settled internally, can create a feedback loop where the outward signal of composure begins to reinforce the internal state itself. This is not about faking confidence you do not have. It is about recognizing that the relationship between your physical presentation and your internal state runs in both directions, and deliberately choosing steady, grounded behavior is itself one more trained input that supports the genuine confidence you are building through preparation and evidence. The energy management system. Everything covered so far in this audiobook assumes a certain baseline of mental and physical energy. But if that baseline is depleted, even the best techniques in the world will struggle to work effectively, because a brain running on empty simply does not have the resources to execute trained responses, no matter how well practiced they are. This is why energy management deserves its own dedicated focus, separate from the mental and emotional techniques covered previously, because it forms the physical foundation everything else depends on. The first principle of energy management is recognizing that mental energy is a genuinely finite resource across any given day, not an unlimited well you can draw from indefinitely through sheer determination. Every decision you make, every instance of resisting a distraction, every moment of emotional regulation draws from this same limited pool, which is why willpower and focus both tend to degrade as the day progresses, regardless of how disciplined you consider yourself to be. Understanding this allows you to make strategic choices about when to schedule your most demanding tasks, protecting your highest energy windows, often earlier in the day for most people, for the work that requires the deepest focus and composure, rather than squandering that peak capacity on less demanding tasks, and then attempting your most important work when your reserves are already low. The second principle involves recognizing the specific factors that silently drain mental energy throughout the day, many of which have nothing to do with the actual difficulty of your work. Constant task switching, unresolved decisions left hanging, cluttered physical environments, and even minor unresolved conflicts with other people all consume mental energy continuously in the background, whether or not you are consciously thinking about them. This is why clearing small, nagging tasks and decisions, sometimes called mental clutter, often produces a surprising boost in available focus for larger tasks. Not because the clutter itself was difficult, but because it was quietly draining resources the entire time it remained unresolved. The third principle centers on the physical inputs that directly determine your brain's capacity to function well, particularly sleep, hydration, and blood sugar stability. A brain that is sleep-deprived shows measurable declines in attention, emotional regulation, and decision-making, changes that no amount of mental technique can fully compensate for, which means that consistent, adequate sleep is not a luxury separate from performance training. It is one of the most powerful performance tools available, arguably more impactful than any single mental technique covered in this audiobook. Similarly, significant dehydration and sharp fluctuations in blood sugar, whether from skipped meals or excessive reliance on sugar and caffeine, create physiological instability that directly undermines your ability to stay calm and focused, regardless of how much mental training you have done. The fourth principle involves building genuine recovery into your regular rhythm, not just physical rest, but true psychological recovery, time spent on activities that do not require sustained focus or performance of any kind, allowing your mind to genuinely disengage rather than simply shifting from one demanding activity to another under the illusion of rest. Many people believe they are resting when they switch from work to scrolling a screen. But this kind of low-quality, highly stimulating activity often fails to provide genuine mental recovery, leaving people feeling just as depleted, sometimes more so than before they took the break. Managing your energy deliberately, protecting peak windows for demanding work, clearing mental clutter, prioritizing sleep and physical stability, and building in genuine recovery creates the foundation that allows every other technique in this audiobook to actually function as intended. Because none of these mental tools can overcome a depleted, poorly managed physical and mental state, no matter how skillfully they are applied. A useful way to think about energy management is to imagine your daily capacity not as a single number, but as several distinct reservoirs: physical energy, emotional energy, and cognitive energy, each of which can be depleted and replenished somewhat independently of the others. A demanding physical day does not necessarily drain your cognitive reservoir, and a day spent in difficult emotional conversations can leave you cognitively fine but emotionally exhausted in a way that still undermines your ability to stay composed under the next pressure you face. Learning to recognize which specific reservoir is running low allows you to choose more targeted recovery. Physical rest after physical exertion, quiet solitude after emotionally demanding interactions, and genuine mental disengagement after intense cognitive work, rather than applying the same generic notion of rest regardless of which resource actually needs replenishing. Over time, this more precise awareness of your own energy state becomes another trained skill in itself, one that allows you to make far better decisions about when to push forward and when to deliberately step back, ensuring that by the time a genuinely high-stakes moment arrives, you are not operating from a depleted reserve, but from a foundation strong enough to fully support everything else you have trained in this audiobook. It also helps to think in terms of a broader weekly rhythm rather than only managing energy day by day, because sustained high performance over months and years requires periodic deeper recovery beyond what a single night of sleep or a short break during the day can provide. Just as physical training programs build in lighter recovery days and occasional extended rest periods to prevent injury and burnout, your mental and emotional energy benefits from a similar structure. Occasional lower intensity days deliberately built into your schedule, not as a reward earned only after exhaustion sets in, but as a proactive part of a sustainable long-term rhythm. People who ignore this broader rhythm often experience a pattern of intense output followed by unexpected crashes, periods of illness, or a sudden loss of motivation that seems to arrive without warning, when in reality, it is the predictable result of consistently ignoring the body's need for deeper, periodic recovery. Building this rhythm deliberately, rather than only responding to exhaustion once it has already taken hold, allows you to maintain a consistently high level of focus and composure across the long term, rather than experiencing the exhausting cycle of pushing hard until you break down and then needing extended time to recover before you can perform at a high level again. Sleep, nutrition, and the focused brain. We touched briefly on the physical foundations of energy earlier in this audiobook, but sleep and nutrition deserve deeper attention on their own, because no amount of mental discipline can fully compensate for a brain that is chemically and physiologically compromised by poor sleep or poor fuel. Consider what actually happens inside your brain during sleep, because it is far more active than most people realize. During deep sleep, your brain consolidates memories, clears out metabolic waste that accumulates during waking hours, and restores the neurotransmitter systems responsible for attention, mood regulation, and impulse control. When sleep is cut short or fragmented, even by what seems like a modest amount, measurable declines appear in exactly the capacities this audiobook has been training: sustained attention, emotional regulation, and the ability to recover quickly from stress. This is not a minor inconvenience. It is a fundamental limitation on your brain's actual hardware, and no mental technique, however well practiced, can fully override a system that has not had adequate rest to function properly. The first practical principle here is protecting your sleep with the same seriousness you would protect any other critical part of your preparation for a high-stakes performance. This means recognizing that the choices you make hours before bed, screen exposure, caffeine timing, and the consistency of your sleep schedule directly shape the quality of the rest you get, which then directly shapes your capacity for focus and composure the following day. A consistent sleep and wake time, even on days without early obligations, helps regulate your internal biological clock far more effectively than compensating with extra sleep on some days and very little on others, because your brain thrives on predictable rhythm rather than erratic patterns. The second principle involves understanding how nutrition affects your brain's moment-to-moment function, not just your long-term health. Sharp spikes and crashes in blood sugar, often caused by meals heavy in refined sugar and light on protein or fiber, create corresponding spikes and crashes in your energy and focus throughout the day, leaving you mentally foggy and emotionally reactive precisely during the crash that follows the spike. Stabilizing your blood sugar through balanced meals containing protein, healthy fats, and fiber, rather than relying on quick sources of sugar or excessive caffeine to power through demanding periods, creates a much steadier foundation for sustained attention and emotional regulation across the day. The third principle involves hydration, an often overlooked factor that has a surprisingly significant impact on cognitive function. Even mild dehydration, well before the point of feeling obviously thirsty, has been shown to impair concentration, working memory, and mood, which means that something as simple as consistent water intake throughout the day functions as a genuine performance tool, not merely a general health recommendation. The fourth principle involves being strategic and honest about caffeine. a substance many people rely on heavily to compensate for inadequate sleep or energy management, without recognizing that excessive or poorly timed caffeine intake can itself contribute to the anxious, jittery physiological state that undermines the very calm and focus this audiobook has been teaching you to build. This does not mean caffeine must be eliminated entirely, but it does mean using it deliberately, in moderate amounts and with attention to timing, rather than as a constant, escalating crutch that ultimately works against your nervous system rather than for it. Taken together, these physical foundations, consistent quality sleep, stable nutrition, adequate hydration, and thoughtful use of stimulants, are not separate from the mental training covered throughout this audiobook. They are the biological substrate that determines how effectively that mental training can actually express itself when you need it most. A practical addition worth adopting is a simple wind-down sequence in the final half hour before sleep. Dimming lights, stepping away from screens, and allowing your mind a period of genuine quiet before attempting to fall asleep. Because the transition into sleep is itself a skill your nervous system performs better with practice and consistency. Many people go directly from high stimulation, a bright screen, an engaging show, a stressful message, straight into an attempt to fall asleep, and then wonder why their mind continues racing once the lights go out. Building a brief, consistent transition period signals to your nervous system that the day's demands are concluding. Easing the shift into the deep, restorative sleep your brain needs to fully support the mental training covered throughout this audiobook. There is one more piece of this physical foundation worth addressing, and that is movement. Regular physical activity, even in modest amounts, produces measurable improvements in mood regulation, stress resilience, and cognitive function, largely through its effects on the same neurochemical systems that govern focus and emotional stability. You do not need an intense or lengthy exercise regimen to benefit from this effect. Even brief, consistent movement, a short walk, a few minutes of stretching, or any activity that gets your body moving on a regular basis, contributes meaningfully to the physical foundation that supports everything else in this audiobook. What matters most is consistency rather than intensity, because the nervous system responds far more reliably to regular, moderate activity sustained over time than to sporadic, intense bursts of exercise separated by long periods of inactivity. Think of physical movement as another input into the same system you have been training throughout this entire audiobook. One more lever alongside sleep, nutrition, and hydration that shapes how effectively your brain can access the focus and composure you have worked to build. It is worth acknowledging directly that building consistency across all of these physical foundations, sleep, nutrition, hydration, movement, at the same time, you are also building the mental and emotional practices covered throughout this audiobook, can feel like a great deal to manage simultaneously. If that is how this feels to you right now, resist the urge to overhaul everything at once. Choose the single physical factor that feels most within reach for you today. Perhaps a slightly earlier bedtime, or a small adjustment to your first meal of the day, and build consistency there before adding the next layer. These physical foundations reinforce each other over time. Improved sleep often naturally supports more stable eating patterns, and more stable eating patterns often support better sleep So progress in one area frequently makes progress in the others easier to sustain, meaning you do not need to force dramatic change everywhere at once in order to eventually experience the full benefit across all of them. It is also worth mentioning the specific relationship between these physical foundations and the composure you build for high-stakes moments that arrive with little warning. Unlike a scheduled presentation you can prepare for days in advance, many of the most demanding pressure moments in life arrive suddenly. An unexpected, difficult conversation, a last-minute crisis, a sudden change in plans that requires immediate, composed thinking. In these unscheduled moments, you do not have the luxury of a careful pre-performance routine or extended mental rehearsal, which means your baseline physical state, however well or poorly maintained in the days and weeks leading up to that moment, becomes the actual foundation you are working from. This is perhaps the strongest argument for treating sleep, nutrition, hydration, and movement as continuous, ongoing practices rather than something you only attend to before scheduled high-stakes events, because life's most demanding pressure often arrives without any advance notice at all, and your consistent physical foundation is what determines how well equipped you are to meet it in that unscheduled moment. Handling high-stakes conversations. Among the many situations that demand focus and composure under pressure, few are as immediately personal and emotionally charged as a high-stakes conversation. Whether that is negotiating something important, delivering difficult feedback, addressing a conflict, or advocating for yourself in a moment that genuinely matters. Unlike a scripted presentation or a solo performance, conversations are unpredictable by nature, shaped by another person's responses, which means the techniques covered so far must be applied dynamically in real time, without the benefit of knowing exactly what is coming next. The first principle for handling these conversations well is entering with clarity about your actual objective, separate from the specific words you plan to say. Many people walk into difficult conversations focused entirely on a script, a set of phrases they intend to deliver. And when the other person responds in an unexpected way, the entire plan falls apart, leaving them scrambling rather than adapting. Instead, clarify your underlying objective. What outcome genuinely matters to you before the conversation begins, so that if the conversation moves in an unexpected direction, you can adapt your specific words while still steering toward what actually matters, rather than becoming derailed the moment reality departs from your rehearsed script. The second principle involves managing your physiological state throughout the conversation itself, not just in the moments before it begins. High-stakes conversations often unfold over several minutes or longer, which means the pressure is not a single spike but a sustained challenge, and your nervous system needs ongoing regulation throughout, not just an initial reset before you begin speaking. This is where the breathing and physical reset techniques covered earlier become genuinely practical tools you can apply discreetly in real time. A slow exhale while the other person is speaking, a conscious release of tension in your shoulders during a pause. Small, invisible adjustments that keep your nervous system regulated throughout an extended, demanding exchange. The third principle involves listening as an active discipline rather than simply waiting for your turn to speak, because pressure has a tendency to narrow your attention inward toward your own next statement or your own internal reaction. At exactly the moment when genuinely understanding the other person matters most, deliberately directing your attention outward toward what the other person is actually saying, both in their words and in their tone and body language not only improves the quality of your response, but also, somewhat counterintuitively, reduces your own internal pressure. Because focusing intently on another person leaves less mental space for anxious self-monitoring. The fourth principle involves managing silence, because many people experience even a brief pause in conversation as uncomfortable pressure to fill immediately, often resulting in rushed, poorly considered responses. Training yourself to tolerate a few seconds of silence, whether to gather your own thoughts or to allow the other person's space to fully express theirs, often produces far more thoughtful, composed exchanges than the instinct to fill every gap immediately. The fifth principle involves recognizing that you do not need to resolve every high-stakes conversation perfectly in a single exchange, and this recognition alone can significantly reduce the pressure you place on any single conversation. Many of the most important conversations in life are not fully resolved in one sitting. They are the beginning of an ongoing dialogue, and giving yourself permission to say that you need time to think, or that you would like to continue the conversation at another point, is often a sign of composure and wisdom rather than a failure to handle the moment. Apply the same trained responses you have built throughout this audiobook. The breath, the narrowed focus on the very next exchange, rather than the entire conversation, the recovery from any misstep, and you will find that even the most emotionally charged conversations become far more manageable than they once felt. It also helps to prepare, before any especially difficult conversation, for the specific reaction you fear most from the other person. Not to catastrophize, but to genuinely think through how you would respond if that exact reaction occurred. Most people avoid this kind of preparation because it feels uncomfortable to imagine the conversation going poorly. But this avoidance leaves you unprepared for exactly the moment you are most worried about, and a brief, deliberate rehearsal of your composed response to that specific fear, using the same mental rehearsal techniques covered earlier, often removes much of its power well before the actual conversation ever takes place. There is also a specific mistake worth avoiding in emotionally charged conversations, and that is allowing your own composed state to slip the moment the other person becomes visibly upset, defensive, or emotional in their response. It is natural to feel your own nervous system react to another person's escalated emotion. Since human beings are highly attuned to the emotional states of those around them, but matching their escalation rather than remaining anchored in your own trained composure almost always makes the conversation harder to resolve productively. Instead, treat the other person's emotional escalation as a signal to apply your own regulation techniques more deliberately, not less, staying steady precisely because the situation has become more volatile, since your steadiness in that moment often has a genuinely calming effect on the conversation as a whole, sometimes more effective than anything you could say. This does not mean suppressing genuine empathy for what the other person is experiencing. It means maintaining your own trained composure as the anchor point that allows you to respond to their emotion thoughtfully rather than being pulled into a reactive escalation alongside them. Finally, consider the value of closing a high-stakes conversation deliberately, rather than simply letting it trail off once the main content has been addressed. A brief, clear summary of what was discussed and what happens next, even in an informal conversation, helps ensure both parties leave with the same understanding, reducing the likelihood of confusion or unresolved tension resurfacing later. This closing moment is also an opportunity to acknowledge the other person directly, whether through genuine appreciation for their openness, their patience, or simply their willingness to engage in a difficult topic at all. Because ending on this note, rather than an abrupt or awkward conclusion, tends to leave both people feeling more settled about the exchange, regardless of how difficult the conversation itself may have been. It is also worth noting that not every high-stakes conversation goes well, no matter how thoroughly you prepare or how skillfully you apply these techniques. Because you can only control your own composure and clarity, not the other person's response, their willingness to engage productively, or the external circumstances surrounding the conversation. Releasing the expectation that every difficult conversation must end in full resolution or agreement is itself part of the composure this chapter has been building toward, because holding yourself to an unrealistic standard of always achieving a perfect outcome only adds unnecessary pressure on top of what is already a genuinely demanding situation. Judge your own performance in these conversations by whether you remained composed, clear, and true to your actual objective, not by whether the other person responded exactly as you hoped, because that distinction between what you can control and what you cannot is precisely the same distinction that has appeared throughout this entire audiobook, and it applies here just as powerfully as anywhere else. Performing under public scrutiny. There is a particular kind of pressure that arises specifically from being watched, evaluated, or judged by others. Whether that audience is a single interviewer, a room full of colleagues, or a much larger public setting. And this social dimension of pressure deserves specific attention because it operates somewhat differently than pressure created by the difficulty of a task alone. Public scrutiny activates deeply rooted social instincts, an ancient concern about how we are perceived by our group, because throughout most of human history, social standing and acceptance were directly tied to survival, which means the discomfort of being watched and judged is not an irrational modern anxiety. It is an ancient response operating in a modern context where the actual stakes are usually far lower than our nervous system perceives them to be. Understanding this origin does not eliminate the sensation, but it does allow you to interpret it more accurately, recognizing that the intensity of the discomfort you feel under scrutiny is often disproportionate to the actual real-world consequences of the moment, which is genuinely useful information when you are trying to regulate your response to it. The first principle for performing well under public scrutiny is recognizing the difference between the actual audience in front of you and the imagined, exaggerated version of that audience your anxious mind often constructs. Under pressure, it is common to imagine an audience that is far more critical, more attentive to your every flaw, and more unified in judgment than any real audience actually is, when in reality, most people watching a presentation or performance are focused primarily on their own experience, only partially attentive, and far less critical than the imagined version your mind constructs. Deliberately reminding yourself of this more accurate, realistic picture of your actual audience can meaningfully reduce the inflated sense of threat that public scrutiny often creates. The second principle involves separating your sense of self-worth from the outcome of any single public performance, because when self-worth becomes entangled with a specific result, the stakes of that result become artificially inflated far beyond their actual importance, which then amplifies the pressure you feel disproportionately. This does not mean caring less about doing well. It means recognizing that your fundamental value as a person does not rise or fall based on how one presentation or performance unfolds, and holding this distinction clearly reduces the emotional intensity of public scrutiny considerably. The third principle involves practicing exposure to smaller-scale versions of public scrutiny deliberately, rather than avoiding all discomfort until a major high-stakes moment forces you to face it for the first time. Just as physical training builds capacity through progressively challenging exposure, comfort with being watched and evaluated builds the same way through repeated, manageable exposure that gradually expands your tolerance. Whether that means speaking up more often in smaller meetings, sharing your work before you feel fully ready, or seeking out lower-stakes opportunities to practice being visible and evaluated. The fourth principle involves recognizing that a certain amount of self-consciousness under scrutiny is completely normal and does not need to be eliminated entirely in order for you to perform well. Many people mistakenly believe that truly confident performers feel no self-consciousness at all, when in reality, most experienced performers still feel some degree of awareness that they are being watched. They have simply trained themselves not to let that awareness dominate their attention or derail their execution, applying the same narrowed focus techniques covered earlier in this audiobook to keep their attention on the task itself rather than on the audience's perceived judgment. Public scrutiny will likely never feel entirely comfortable, and that discomfort does not need to disappear completely in order for you to perform with genuine composure and skill. There is also value in shifting your internal framing of the audience itself, from an evaluating panel focused on judging you toward a group of people who are, in most genuine cases, hoping to see you succeed, whether that is an interviewer wanting to find the right candidate, an audience wanting to be engaged and informed, or colleagues wanting a productive outcome from the interaction. This reframe is not naive optimism. It reflects a more accurate reading of most real-world situations, where the people watching you generally have far more invested in a positive outcome than in seeing you fail, and adopting this more accurate framing often reduces the adversarial quality that public scrutiny can otherwise seem to carry. It also helps to prepare a specific plan for the physical sensations that public scrutiny tends to trigger. Since these sensations, a flushed face, a shaking hand, a wavering voice, can themselves become an additional source of anxiety once a person becomes aware of them and begins worrying that others will notice. This creates a secondary layer of pressure on top of the original one, worrying about the visible signs of nervousness rather than simply the performance itself. Understanding that these physical signs are almost always far less noticeable to an audience than they feel to the person experiencing them can help reduce this secondary anxiety considerably, and applying the same physical reset techniques covered earlier, a slow breath, a conscious release of tension, works just as effectively here as in any other high-pressure context. Over time, as you accumulate genuine experience performing under scrutiny and directly observe that these physical sensations rarely derail your performance the way you once feared, this secondary layer of anxiety tends to fade considerably, leaving you free to focus your attention where it belongs, on the actual task in front of you, rather than on managing how you appear while doing it. One final consideration deserves attention here, and that is the role of preparation, specifically tailored to the format of public scrutiny you are about to face. Since different formats carry different demands, a live question and answer session requires comfort with genuine unpredictability and the ability to think clearly on the spot, while a scripted presentation demands thorough familiarity with your material so that delivery feels natural rather than recited. Understanding which specific demands a given situation places on you allows you to direct your preparation more precisely, rather than applying a generic approach to every form of public exposure, regardless of its actual structure. Someone who has thoroughly prepared for a scripted talk may still feel caught off guard by an unexpected question afterward. Not because their preparation was inadequate, but because they prepared for one format while facing a different one, and recognizing this distinction in advance allows you to prepare deliberately for both the structured and unstructured portions of whatever public moment you are about to face. There is also a longer-term benefit to accumulating experience with public scrutiny that goes beyond any single event. And that is the way each experience, handled with even partial success, gradually reshapes your baseline relationship with being watched and evaluated. Early in this process, even a modest public moment might feel intensely threatening. But as you continue applying the principles covered in this chapter, narrowing your focus, holding a realistic view of your actual audience, separating your worth from any single outcome, each subsequent experience tends to feel somewhat less overwhelming than the last, not because the external circumstances have changed, but because your internal relationship with scrutiny itself has been steadily retrained. This is the same underlying principle that has appeared throughout this entire audiobook, applied here specifically to the social dimension of pressure, and it is worth remembering that the discomfort you feel today under public scrutiny is not a fixed, permanent state. It is simply your current starting point on a trajectory you now have genuine tools to shift. The consistency engine. Everything covered throughout this audiobook, from the biology of pressure to mental rehearsal to managing high-stakes conversations, depends on one final, often underestimated factor for its long-term effectiveness, and that factor is consistency. A technique practiced once, even perfectly, produces a temporary benefit at best, while the same technique practiced consistently over weeks and months produces lasting transformation in how your brain and nervous system respond to pressure by default. This chapter is dedicated entirely to building the kind of consistency that turns everything you have learned from occasional effort into permanent capability. The first principle of building lasting consistency is understanding that motivation is an unreliable foundation to build any long-term practice on, because motivation naturally fluctuates based on mood, energy, and circumstance, which means a practice that depends entirely on feeling motivated will inevitably collapse the moment motivation dips, as it inevitably will. Instead, durable consistency comes from building structure and systems that function regardless of how motivated you feel on any given day. A specific time set aside for practice, a clear and minimal version of the practice you can complete even on your lowest energy days, and environmental cues that prompt the behavior automatically, rather than requiring you to consciously decide to engage in it every single time. The second principle involves starting with a version of each practice that is genuinely sustainable, even if that means starting smaller than you initially want to. A common and costly mistake is attempting to implement every technique covered in this audiobook simultaneously and intensively from day one, which often produces an unsustainable initial burst of effort, followed by complete abandonment once the novelty fades and life's normal demands reassert themselves. Instead, choose one or two specific practices to build consistently first, whether that is the daily breathing practice, a brief mental rehearsal session, or simply noticing and naming the pressure traps as they arise, and allow that consistency to establish itself fully before adding additional layers, because a small practice performed reliably every day produces far greater long-term benefit than an ambitious, comprehensive practice performed only sporadically. The third principle involves tracking your consistency itself, not just tracking outcomes or performance results, because the simple act of monitoring whether you actually engaged in a practice on a given day creates accountability and visibility that significantly increases the likelihood you will continue. This tracking does not need to be elaborate. Even a simple mark on a calendar or a brief note indicating whether you practiced that day provides enough visibility to notice patterns, celebrate genuine streaks, and catch lapses before they become permanent abandonment of the practice altogether. The fourth principle involves planning explicitly for the inevitable disruptions that will interrupt any consistent practice over time: travel, illness, unusually demanding periods at work, because a plan that only works under ideal, uninterrupted conditions is not actually a sustainable long-term system. Decide in advance what a minimal, maintainable version of your practice looks like during genuinely difficult periods, so that a disruption does not have to mean complete abandonment, and so that resuming your full practice afterward feels like a natural continuation rather than starting over completely from the beginning. Consistency is not about perfection, and expecting flawless daily adherence sets an unrealistic standard that often backfires, producing exactly the kind of all-or-nothing thinking that derails long-term habits. What matters far more than perfection is the pattern over time, the general trend of returning to your practice again and again, even after inevitable lapses, because it is this long arc of consistent return, not any single unbroken streak, that ultimately produces the deep, lasting transformation in how your brain handles focus and pressure that this entire audiobook has been building toward. It is worth naming one more force that quietly undermines consistency for many people: the tendency to abandon a practice entirely the moment it stops producing noticeable results, without recognizing that many of the deepest benefits of consistent training accumulate gradually and are often invisible in the short term, becoming clear only when you look back over a period of weeks or months rather than days. Trusting the process during this less visible early period, even without dramatic evidence of change day to day, is often exactly what separates those who eventually experience the full transformation this audiobook describes from those who quit just before the compounding effects of their consistent practice would have become undeniable. There is one more principle worth adding to your consistency system, and that is the value of periodic, honest review of your progress across a longer time horizon than day-to-day tracking allows. Set aside a brief period, perhaps once every few weeks, to reflect specifically on how your relationship with focus and pressure has shifted since you began this practice, not through vague impressions but through specific memories. A moment where you handled a mistake with more composure than you would have previously. A conversation where you stayed grounded despite real tension. A performance where your trained breath work genuinely made a difference. This periodic review serves two important functions. It provides the concrete evidence of growth that fuels the durable, process-based confidence covered earlier in this audiobook. And it also gives you the opportunity to notice which specific techniques are producing the most benefit for you personally, allowing you to refine your practice over time rather than treating every technique in this audiobook as equally essential for your particular needs and circumstances. Some people find that breathwork produces the most noticeable shift in their composure, while others find mental rehearsal or the consistency tracking itself to be the more powerful lever, and there is no single correct answer here. Only the answer that your own honest, periodic reflection reveals about what genuinely works best for you. It is also worth considering how your consistent practice can evolve alongside your life circumstances, rather than remaining static and unchanging indefinitely. As certain techniques become deeply ingrained, requiring less conscious effort to apply, you may find room to add new layers of practice, deeper mental rehearsal, more challenging exposure to public scrutiny, or more ambitious, high-stakes conversations you once would have avoided entirely. Consistency is not simply about maintaining the exact same practice forever. It is about building a reliable foundation that can support continued growth over time, gradually expanding what you are capable of handling with genuine composure as your trained capacity deepens. Think of this entire system: the breath work, the focus training, the mental rehearsal, the recovery practices, the energy management, as a living practice that grows alongside you, rather than a fixed program you complete once and then set aside. Because the version of pressure and challenge you face 5 years from now will likely look quite different from what you face today, and the strength of your consistency practice is precisely what will allow you to meet that future challenge with the same trained composure you are building right now, becoming pressure-proof for life. We began this audiobook with a simple but important truth: that focus and calm under pressure are not fixed traits you either possess or lack. They are trainable capacities, built the same way any skill is built, through understanding, deliberate practice, and consistent repetition over time. Throughout everything covered since then, the biology of pressure, the mental traps that sabotage performance, the specific techniques for deep focus and real-time composure, mental rehearsal, recovery from mistakes, confidence built on genuine evidence, energy management, and the consistency required to make all of it permanent. One theme has remained constant beneath every chapter. You are not trying to eliminate pressure from your life, because pressure in appropriate amounts is not your enemy. It is often what sharpens performance and gives meaningful moments their weight and significance in the first place. What you are building instead is a trained, reliable relationship with pressure. One where your nervous system knows exactly how to respond when the stakes rise, where your attention narrows productively rather than scattering into panic, and where a mistake becomes a moment for composed recovery rather than a spiral into further errors. This transformation does not happen overnight, and it does not happen through reading or listening alone. It happens through the accumulated weight of genuine practice, the daily breathwork, the deliberate focus training, the mental rehearsal sessions, the honest tracking of your own growth, repeated consistently until these responses become less like techniques you have to consciously remember and more like simply who you are under pressure. Consider what becomes possible once this transformation genuinely takes hold. The presentations that once filled you with dread become opportunities to demonstrate what you have built. The difficult conversations you once avoided become manageable, even when they remain challenging. The moments of public scrutiny that once felt overwhelming become simply another situation you know how to navigate. Not because the discomfort disappears entirely, but because you have trained a response that keeps you steady and effective despite that discomfort. This is what it genuinely means to become pressure-proof. Not the absence of nerves, not immunity to difficulty, but a deep, trained trust in your own ability to remain clear, composed, and effective no matter what any given moment demands of you. That trust is not something anyone can give you, and it is not something that arrives through wishing or hoping for confidence to magically appear. It is built piece by piece through exactly the kind of deliberate, consistent practice covered throughout this audiobook, and the fact that you have made it this far is itself evidence that you are the kind of person willing to do the work that this transformation requires. Return to these chapters as often as you need to. Practice the techniques that resonated most deeply with you. Build your own version of the routines, the rehearsal, and the consistency system described here, adapted to your own life and your own specific challenges. The brain you have right now is not fixed. It is remarkably capable of change when you give it the right training, applied consistently over time, and the version of yourself who moves through pressure with genuine focus and calm is not a distant, unreachable ideal. It is simply the natural result of the practice you are now equipped to begin. Carry this with you the next time pressure rises, whatever form it takes, because you now have something most people never take the time to build: a genuine, trained understanding of how your own mind and body respond under stress, and a complete set of tools to meet that response with clarity instead of chaos. The moments that once felt like threats to survive are steadily becoming moments you know how to walk through with steadiness. And every time you apply what you have learned here, that capability grows a little stronger, a little more automatic, a little more simply a part of who you are. This is not the end of the work. It is the beginning of a lifelong practice, one that will keep paying you back, in composure, in clarity, and in quiet confidence, for as long as you continue to return to it. Think back for a moment to the very beginning of this audiobook, to that familiar feeling described at the start, the tightening body, the scattering thoughts, the sense of a clear mind slipping away exactly when it was needed most. That feeling has not disappeared from the world, and it will very likely visit you again at some point, because it is simply part of being human and facing moments that genuinely matter. But your relationship with that feeling has now fundamentally changed. Where it once arrived as an unwelcome, overwhelming stranger, it now arrives as something familiar, something you know how to meet, something you have trained yourself, deliberately and specifically, to work with rather than be ruled by. This shift from being at the mercy of pressure to having a trained, capable relationship with it is available to anyone willing to do the work described throughout this audiobook, and it is available to you starting today, in the very next moment that calls for it. Whatever high-stakes moment comes next in your life, a conversation, a performance, a decision, a challenge you cannot yet fully predict, you now carry something durable into it. A mind you have trained to find clarity when it matters most, and a nervous system you have trained to find calm even when everything around you feels uncertain. That is not a small thing. That is the entire foundation of a life lived with genuine composure. And it is yours now, built through the work you have done here, ready to be applied the very next time you need it. If there is one final thought worth carrying forward above everything else covered in this audiobook, let it be this: You do not need to wait until you feel completely ready, completely confident, or completely free of nerves before you begin applying what you have learned. The techniques covered here were never meant to eliminate every trace of pressure from your life. They were meant to give you a trained, reliable way of moving through pressure while it is still present, because that is the actual reality every person faces, no matter how experienced or accomplished they become. The next time your heart begins to race before something important, let that sensation be the cue that activates your training rather than a signal that something has gone wrong. The next time your mind starts to spiral into imagined failure, let that be the moment you gently redirect your attention back to the very next action in front of you. The next time you make a mistake in front of others, let that be the opportunity to demonstrate the composed recovery you have practiced, rather than the beginning of a spiral you once might have fallen into. Each of these moments, handled with the tools you now carry, becomes one more piece of evidence, one more repetition, one more small proof that you are capable of meeting pressure with clarity rather than being overwhelmed by it. Over time, these individual moments accumulate into something larger, a genuine, dependable trust in yourself that no single outcome, good or bad, can fully shake. That is what it means to become pressure-proof. Not a single achievement you unlock and then possess forever without further effort, but an ongoing practice you carry with you, growing stronger every time you choose to apply it. For as long as you choose to keep training the mind and body you have been given,